Smeltzer, did I say that correctly?
You did.
How you doing, my friend?
I am doing wonderful. Nice and warm down here in Texas, middle of summer. So as long as you don't melt, you're pretty much good.
Yeah, or if your AC doesn't go out, I would imagine that would be a bigger problem, right?
That is, they are very much in demand at this time of the year. The HVAC guys do very well over the summer.
Best friend, slip a 20 in their pocket every so often
Yeah,
when you
right.
see them. Awesome.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you for being a guest on the masterclass. I don't know if you've ever seen these before, but the whole concept of the masterclass is education for education's sake. We pick a very, in our opinion, a highly regarded professional who's doing amazing things in their industry specifically. And we kind of pair that with our monthly theme, which this past month was environmental wellness and anything to do with health and the environmental impact. So we'll get into that with some questions that I have, but I like to start this in a very conversational style by asking, what's your story? What compelled you to become a health professional who, as you said, is booked from, dawn till dusk these days? Tell us your background, please.
Well, I appreciate that. Originally, actually, I was not in this at all. I did get my PA degree back in 2002, but I immediately went into emergency medicine, did that for years, went into orthopedics, did hip and knee replacement, did sports medicine. And it wasn't until my son, who at the time was 2, or not even 2, basically lost all of his development, regressed from a multitude of things, not the least being vaccine injury, and regressed into autism. Over the next 4 years, my better half, Linda, actually healed him from the multitude of things that were going on. And slowly but surely, he not only got all of his development back, but lost his diagnosis. So in that time, I started learning more and more about why the things that my wife was doing were working.
Wow.
And that led me down the path of not being able to not do this as a career. So through that journey and all of the, trials and tribulations that came with it, I ended up working at a office in Chicago with a mentor of mine, Dr. Anju Usman. And through that time and learning, we found that my son, and in fact, my whole family just did better in warmer climates. So we moved and packed up the bus and moved down to San Antonio. And in that amount of time, we started Healing Provisions. And Healing Provisions originally was supposed to be basically for children on the spectrum. And it has now evolved into basically anything that is chronic in nature that environment may be influencing. So what evolved from there is not only seeing kids, but also adults, and not just addressing specifically their nutrient deficiencies, but really focusing in on the environmental medicine side of that, which is the everything affects everything. And, I was blessed to not only become a member of the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, but also become their first physician assistant fellow ever, and become on their board of directors, and now have, along with my, again, better half, Linda, are now co-executive directors of the American Academy of Environmental Medicine. And we could not be happier to share all of what we are teaching and learning with Master Supplements, US Enzymes, as they've been a partner of ours for a very long time, and philosophies couldn't be more similar.
I love that you said that, and thank you for that story. There's nothing more amazing than when someone is so compelled that there's no choice. It's like, no, I'm doing this. There's no plan B. And I'm assuming your son's feeling good these days.
Yeah, he went from, on the spectrum and got off the spectrum at about 7. Now he's a 17-year-old, typical teenager trying to sort out things. And we don't treat him any different.
Well, there's no cure for being a teenager. That's got to run its course.
Yeah, that is for sure. And he's one of 6. So he's got
Oh, wow.
plenty of teachers and he's teaching, and he's he just finished a 3-week leadership camp down here in Texas. So we couldn't be more proud of all of our kids. But Nick's just the same thing. He's just he's being a thriving, healthy child.
It's awesome. I mean, thank you again. It's so wonderful to hear those outcomes. You said something in that story that piqued my interest that I actually want to have you define if we can, just off the cuff. How do you define environmental medicine? Because there are a lot of different sectors. There's evolutionary medicine, there's chronobiological medicine, and environmental medicine. It seems obvious, but I'm sure there's some nuance that people would actually appreciate teasing out.
No, that's a great question, actually. And I think the thing that separates environmental medicine from the evolutionary or even the functional medicine is that it very much focuses in on the exposure side of it, and not only what the exposure does from an allergenic standpoint, but also from a chronic inflammatory standpoint. And that alone can trigger a multitude of not only chronically inflammatory conditions, but then also autoimmune, which when you think about chronic disease in the US right now, how many of them are either chronically inflammatory or autoimmune?
Almost all.
So that then goes back to the immunologic dysfunction, which then goes down to all of the different things from both a systematic standpoint. So think of all these endocrine problems we're having, from diabetes and hormone dysregulation, heart disease, liver disease, all of the different things systematically go down the line. If you look at it from an environmental medicine lens, you aren't looking at the end result. What you're looking at is the triggers that started the ball rolling down into that problem. And that then all goes back to, where did it begin in the first place? And that is something that the body either didn't digest the right way, or they got exposed to from a toxicant standpoint that then set off this inflammatory signal that turned into a chronic inflammatory signal, which then learned to an environment or an immunological dysfunction, which then triggers an autoimmune reaction. And then we start looking at it at the end, when in actuality, if you go backwards, we could actually think about it from a reverse engineering standpoint, correct the initial issue, and maybe reverse the autoimmune condition.
I love that systems thinking approach, because the general term "everything affects everything," it's never not true in the case of the body, because the interconnected nature of the body is so that if you section it off, like Western medicine has unfortunately done, well, there's still value in being able to help someone to a degree. You're losing the whole idea of how the puzzle piece fits together. And if you take that up to the concept of environment, there's tens of thousands of chemical compounds floating around in our environment that have been introduced since the Industrial Revolution, and it's probably getting worse. How do you guys go about screening people from an environmental impact perspective? How do you assess that?
It starts off very comprehensive, actually. Think of it like a crime scene. So instead of starting with the symptom and treating the symptom, we take the symptom and then go backwards and look at it from a much more global perspective. And we start saying, okay, where did this start going wrong? So where does that start? It starts with an excellent history. This is still medicine. This is still about understanding where the story comes from, because as in many instances, if you actually take the time and talk to the patient, they'll tell you what's wrong with them. Not just the symptoms, but actually go back and see where this all kind of came from. Then you start asking better questions. And that's the key to environmental medicine, is understanding where things started, so that then you can start to piece together all those puzzle pieces where now we have this mess. So from a crime scene standpoint, we're gathering clues. So then once you get through that kind of thorough history that really actually addresses maybe all the way back from exposures they had when they were a kid to things that maybe they were infected with and had recurrent infections, to then maybe they had some hormone dysregulation and they started peeing on the pill. All of those things matter. That's the everything affects everything. Because what does the body do? The body's trying to keep that equilibrium all the time. And if we have something that's tilting it here and then you push it here, now when something comes up, now this one's starting to go down. Now all of a sudden the body's doing this all the time. And that's how many people feel. They feel like they're on this just yo-yo of one thing gets better and another thing pops up. Well, if you actually addressed it from here in the first place, the body doesn't have to keep compensating. So then we do lab testing, and it's not just figure out what their blood says, see if they have some kind of inflammation. This actually goes all the way down to what they're putting in, what are they even absorbing? And if they're not absorbing, why not? So that's why we look at things like stool testing to see if that microbiome is actually in an abundant state or in a diverse state that actually maximizes absorbing what you're putting in. And then the other side of that from an absorption standpoint is you can't put garbage in and not get garbage out. So we do a very thorough dietary history, because if you're eating a bunch of non-food and I can't understand why you're fatigued, you got your answer. So all of that is just in the very initial appointment, just beginning to understand not only from what's going on, but maybe why they aren't getting better in the first place. So that begins a lot of it, but then we start doing things like stool testing to see what that microbiome looks like, to see if there's an inflammatory process, heck, to see if there's infection. I have diagnosed many parasitic infections, bacterial infections, even viral infections in the bowel that they weren't having typical symptoms from. But that's phase one of absorption. Phase two is actually from what they actually absorb into the blood, what's actually getting utilized in the cell. So this all goes to the economics of energy, where people, in order to get through their day, they got to be able to meet the demand with their supply. And if they're only absorbing 60 to 70% of what they're actually eating, they're not doing so hot as far as any, reserve from an energy standpoint. And we start thinking about chronic issues and chronic conditions, a lot of it has to do with the body compensating for not having enough energy to even get through their day. It's where a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fatigue comes from. So that alone will give us an idea from a metabolic standpoint, what is going on. Then we do blood testing, not necessarily for the basics like a blood count from a chemistries, but actually seeing, are they anemic? What's their iron levels? What are their minerals? But also looking, do they have allergies? I can't tell you how many people come in with immune dysregulation symptoms that haven't even had a basic allergy test, that haven't even had any kind of real immunologic workup to see what they've been exposed to from a viral standpoint, from a bacterial standpoint, from a mycoplasma standpoint, that actually then we get an idea if their body has overreacted to it. Is it underreacted? Is it something maybe they had a vaccine to before that they aren't even showing any immunity to now? Or on the flip side, I have patients that have had vaccines where their response is 17,000 times greater than it should be. Does it matter? At least it's a question. And instead of just assuming everything, we're actually investigating it. And by doing that, we're starting to put those puzzle pieces together. And what that leads us to those next steps, to say, if there's this chronic inflammatory process, if there's immune dysregulation, then we need to sort out, is there then toxicity? is there something toxic that's triggering and putting a monkey wrench into this whole system, which then downstream can affect hormones. Not only is it energy, but hormones. So yeah, when you kind of say, what's the approach? You can see that it's not just system-based, it's entire system-based.
It's very
It
process oriented.
really gets into teasing through all of those possible things that then gets to the heart of the matter, which then basically the side effect of all the treatments is they get better.
It's amazing. I mean, what you just said is the equivalent of music to me, and I'll tell you why. Is because, a huge motivation that I've had for this whole purpose of interviewing successful and highly regarded professionals is for anyone to be successful, I believe they figured something out. Not everything, because no one knows everything, but they figured something out and they found their wheelhouse, their niche, whatever way you want to describe it. And there's commonalities and patterns that I'm looking for. And what I'm really starting to notice, and I think this is what, I'm hoping that we can bring to the functional medicine and the alternative, even heck, the allopathic medical industry, is it's process driven. It's not protocol driven. So what you just said, each individual person gets their own investigatory plan, so to speak. And then only once you've reverse engineered everything to the best of your abilities do you come up with a starting point. You don't go, oh, you have this, here's the protocol for this, or here's how I'm going to approach that. To get people healthy, you need to basically heal them in the reverse order of how they got sick. I love that you said that because for me, that's the biological medicine way, which has been a huge influence in how I think. And with that, we get so focused on the end result, meaning the diagnosis becomes the everything. But we haven't yet understood that each individual diagnosis and the pathway there is a unique process that's individual to the person. So if you don't reverse engineer it and think of it as a process driven thing, you might just be the next stop on that person's quest to get well again. So, I mean, I love how you describe that. Can I ask, currently in 2023, are you seeing any emerging common patterns among people, even within the understanding that it's individual process to the person? Are there patterns that you're starting to see that are environmental in nature and how they're impacting people?
Oh man, it's a great question. And to kind of expand on what you had said, the biggest thing I think you're stating and what I'm stating, what we all kind of believe in is instead of asking the diagnosis, let's figure out the why. You have diabetes. Well, why do you have type 2 diabetes? What the process that led to that, so that maybe then instead of just managing it, we actually heal it. And to what's been going on over these last 3 years, especially this year, what's really been interesting and kind of sad is how much now people with chronic inflammatory conditions, autoimmune conditions, or just people that were stable through the pandemic now all of a sudden are not having the stability, or now they're having new autoimmune conditions. And unfortunately, I see a lot of kids, and it is not uncommon for me to hear probably 2 to 3 times a week in new patients that my kid used to be able to go to school. My kid used to thrive in classrooms. My kid did great. And now they can't even get into a classroom because they're so high anxiety. They are so stressed out and anxious about even just going to school that they literally can't make it through a day. And as we start to piece this together, we're starting to see that the burden that these kids have been put through these last 3 years, in addition to the environment that we put them in, from the water they're drinking, the air they're breathing, the food that they're eating, their ability to compensate for that, which should be at its greatest at this age, is being overwhelmed to a state that they're spilling over and having anxiety symptoms simply because the stress that they've been put under through all the fear that's been perpetuated over the last 2 to 3 years is now manifesting in their inability to cope with just the normal stressors of a school day.
Wow.
So if I were to say there was anything that was the most significant, it is the epidemic of anxiety. And that's why they're calling this generation the anxiety generation, which is tragic and makes me insane, because when you start breaking it down into what all those components could be, it's very obvious that we are the cause. It is our culture, it's our society, it's our inability to empower these kids to actually take on and have some resilience to be able to then be able to handle some of these things, but give them the tools instead of trying to put them into this isolation bubble of no exposure.
That, it's so interesting you say that, because I've had a couple occurrences, and something literally just fell on my plate 2 days ago, where I do a lot of work with athletes, and I have this one new athlete who he's basically been given the go-ahead. If he shows up in shape, he's basically on the Florida Panthers. 21-year-old kid. And I did my intake session with him. His big issue is body composition, which is weird. At a 21 years old, he shouldn't be holding 17, 18% body fat. So there's something metabolic inflammatory in nature. But the takeaway from the conversation was that all of this started 3 years ago with COVID. He stopped being able to eat breakfast because he was getting too stressed out. Then every time he ate, he would feel horrible. Then it made him have panic, and he was stuck by himself. And when people finally get to relax after a period of stress, that's when the illness comes out. It's never during the stress. The stress drives you to find, homeostasis in the craziness, so to speak. But now that things are calming down and returning to normal, whatever that, word becomes, we're starting to see what's going to happen to people. And I think it's so important that as practitioners, even if we don't necessarily have formal training in it, because we're focusing on physiology and tissue, we need to understand the import of mental, psycho-emotional, and even spiritual influences, because I believe the body is the last place these things show up. Like, if you've been harboring anger for years and you got some liver stuff, like, that didn't just come in overnight. There's a point to where the body's going to go, well, no, no more, my friend. I'm not going to compensate anymore. You're going to deal with this because I'm going to make it so that your life is so compromised. So that's a really interesting aspect of environment, because I call those the non-physical environmental factors. Thoughts or things, the music you listen to, the TV shows you watch, the social media you scroll through. They're all being intaken by our system, and they have to have some sort of physical effect.
But think about the exposure level that even when you were a kid, or even when I was a kid, to what these kids are exposed to on a daily basis. As I said, I tell our families, I'm like, this kid, like, when we were kids, our world was very small. And if something wasn't happening in our neighborhood, maybe we would know if it was happening in our town. And very rarely we knew if it was anything really outside of our state. There's somebody who could fart in Nepal now, and our children know, because there's so much input, there's so much bombardment, that it just perpetuates that anxiety. Then couple it with something that everybody's affected by, and it's constantly being shoved in their faces, and also the fear of they're the ones that could be causing a problem. That to me was just insanity in regards to what the collateral damage of that fear mongering was.
So if I can ask a question of taking this conceptually and then connect it to something a little more practically, in your opinion, so you don't have to have like a defined concrete answer, where in the body are you seeing this crippling anxiety affect most? Is it the nervous system? Is it at the gut level? Is it sleep influence? Like, where are you seeing the physical change that is being driven by such a thing?
Yes.
All of them.
It really is.
Check,
and
check,
I'll
check.
explain my answer, Roland, from a standpoint of the manifestations of the body not being able to compensate for whatever that fear, whatever that anxiety is. Sometimes, yes, it manifests in the actual emotional mental state. But I have had patients where their gut is now, they can't regulate stool from a standpoint of diarrhea, constipation, alternating. I have had patients with crippling fatigue. They don't feel anxious, but they can't get out of their house for longer than 20 minutes without having to basically be done. I've had it where patients have had hives, skin, just horrible psoriasis and eczema. We've had it in hormones. Oh, some of these poor girls that I see that normal cycles, little bit of cramping, a little bit of PMS. Now it's crippling.
2 days in bed with some Midol, right?
Anxiety over their upcoming, week before their period because they know it's coming again. And that literally is almost to the point where they are so debilitated by it, they really can't function in the days they're even well. So I looked at what COVID and the virus did from an actual standpoint, and I called it basically the Great Masquerader, because what it did is it took any of the weaknesses that the body may have and tried to exploit them. So if you had any chronic inflammation, maybe in your lungs, or maybe you had a little bit of liver issues, or maybe you had a little bit of anxiety, once you got kind of knocked down by that virus, or if you had the vaccine, which then created the mRNA version of the spike protein, that then circulated and created all of this immune overreactivity. And that's where it was able to create the chaos in your immune system, which then addressed or manifested in basically any of the weaknesses that your body was already dealing with. That's why if you were fairly healthy, the virus was basically an annoyance. But if you had some chronic issues or you were extremely overweight, you were in real trouble. And that's back when we had more of the virus issue, which again, come back to what could we do to address some of the after long haul effects. Well, you have to think of it from how do we address the immune overreactivity? How do we stop getting it so it's always triggered? And that has to do with that spike protein and what the immune system's overreacting to.
So why don't we explore that a little bit more conceptually? Because obviously you can't tell someone what to do for a person you don't know. But how would you start to teach someone how to think about addressing these things? Because I've actually tried to understand how to ask these questions better, right? So when someone says immune overreactivity, well, we don't know what to do for that. Someone's like, what supplement do I give someone? I don't know, the one that works, but you have to think through the process. So if we're thinking about inflammatory insult, if we're thinking about digestive dysfunction, we're thinking about immune reactivity, or anything that kind of dovetails into a symptom from that, how do you think about deciding the intervention?
Again, you first have to go backwards. And, it just goes back to, well, if you're going to have immune dysregulation, where does the immune system seem to be most abundant? And this is a big misconception by most people, that they think it's in your lymph nodes, or it's in your blood, or, it's in your organs. And it's very rarely starting to get better, but most people don't understand that 75 to 80% of your immune system's in your gut. So when you start talking about immune dysregulation, you start there. And that goes back to, what are you putting in? What are you actually absorbing? And what are you unintentionally, but actually causing an increase in the immune reactivity right there? And that goes to diet. That goes to what your body is actually digesting. So you could be eating good, you could be eating well, having a good variety, you got good fruits and vegetables, you're getting a good amount of protein and fats. But if you have previous damage from a viral illness, from antibiotic use, your ability to absorb that is compromised. Well, your immune system needs energy too. And if that's not working very efficiently, that leads to then it becoming more confused. So that would be kind of a starting point. Then you start saying, well, if you've had certain viruses, and you feel like that kind of going back into when their symptoms started, because a lot of times you can figure out that they were ill or had a virus prior to, or they had strep throat multiple times when they were, younger. And that cascade of situations then manifests as an autoimmune inflammatory process down the road. So what do we do about that? You first things first, get your foundation straight, get your digestion optimized. Don't put in not food. Start hydrating, getting your minerals in so that your body has everything it needs so that when you do try to do something a little bit more aggressively, it can handle it. Then you can start talking about things like, mast cell stabilization, different types of immunotherapies, allergy treatments, systemic enzymes to basically break up some of the things that are trying to dysregulate your immune system in the first place. So there's a lot that can be done, even in a generic way, that really can make a very big impact in reversing some of that chronic inflammatory process.
Yeah, it's amazing. And you just gave me about 3 or 4 more things to ask you, and I have to figure out which one I want to go with first. I want to start with digestion because we are a digestive wellness company. It's the foundational basis of the master supplement side of US Enzymes. And I believe that the gut is something that interests people, but the process of digestion, not so much, because it's not super sexy. It's not like the latest thing. But when you say get your digestion right, what do you specifically mean by that statement?
To me, it goes to optimization of nutrient density, okay? And it's nutrient density of what you put in. That's quality of food that you're putting in. Everybody from a standpoint of knowing that a food is a food, but there's different amounts of nutrient density in different foods. And that's something you have to research. Carbohydrates have a certain amount of calories per gram versus fats versus proteins. But then there's also what else is in the food. Because you could have a sandwich that has organic lettuce, tomato, a little bit of cheese, but it's all organic. Then you have the exact same sandwich that's made with GMO, grain, conventionally grown produce. And not only is it going to have a little bit higher nutrient density from the standpoint of actual minerals, vitamins, and nutrients, but you also have to remember that all the chemicals that are in this sandwich, your body is now going to have to subtract energy to actually get rid of all of this. So your net deficit of this versus this is going to be pretty dramatic. And that's
such an important thing. I just want to touch on for a second there. I've never thought of it that way, because detoxification is a very energy intensive process. So when someone's eating something that's chemically laden or something that is of questionable origins, even though calories are coming in, those calories powering you through the day to some degree are going to get diverted for other biological processes to offset the crappiness of your decision.
Think of leaded fuel versus unleaded fuel. Both are fuel. Both will make your car run. One will just make your car run kind of crappy.
Like putting diesel in a sports car, you won't get very far. Oh, that rhymed. That was kind of cool.
And then you think of, okay, well, then what do I do to maximize that? You put super unleaded in, because higher octane, same amount of fuel. You're getting more energy from the same amount of fuel. That's the definition of nutrient density. Now, that's one area. That's one aspect. The second phase of that is, what are you absorbing? That's why optimizing enzymes, making sure you have the right probiotics, because probiotics maximizes your breakdown of that food so that you finish the digestion. So when you absorb it, your immune system says, that's lettuce, that's tomato, that's chicken. Versus if you miss 5 or 10% of that digestion, it sneaks into the bloodstream. Your immune system may say that's an invader and actually attack it. which again, net negative as far as getting any energy from. That's why I love this economics of energy, because it really speaks to understanding that in and out is not that simple. And efficiency of what you put in and what you actually absorb to get utilized is everything when it comes to whether your body has a surplus or a deficit when it comes to what getting through your day.
I mean, it's so obvious in the sense of once you've seen it clinically, once you have understood the mechanisms of action of the processes, you see how everything fits together. And, you know, I'm actually hoping that patients become the doctors of tomorrow in the sense of this thing kind of catching fire to where if they sit down in a restaurant, this is what I do. I don't know if well, I know that I'm weird, but I'll say the example anyways. I don't know if you do this, but I look at a menu and I do a quick nutritional assessment of how the meal's been put together. You know, how is it going to affect my glycemic index? What's the protein quantity? What fats are there? What vitamins and minerals may be present? If we can teach people to think that way, then their economics of energy is going to look pretty good. Because if you look at it like a bank account, they're going to have some reserve left over for when they do want to spend on a piece of cheesecake or burger and fries with the kids every so often, because there should be some ability to enjoy that in life. So that's a really amazing way of understanding it. But the in-between is so important because not only are we talking about the absorption and the potential issues with absorption that become problematic, but there's also at the epithelial layer, we have immune cells, we have microbes, we have potential reactions, and we have a thin mucosal layer. So when it comes to probiotics and digestion, can you draw some sort of connection there that you see clinically?
Not only clinically, but also from a laboratory representation, because a lot of what we do from a stool testing standpoint looks at that mucosal layer from a standpoint, from how well the things that should be in there stay in there. Because if you're losing a lot of calprotectin, you're losing a lot of lactoferrin, you're actually dumping some of your beta-glucuronidase. These are all molecules and components of the mucosa you don't want coming out in your stool. So if you're seeing a lot of that coming out, that means that your mucosa is actually getting broken down. Well, what builds that up? What builds that up are the things from a nutrient standpoint: proteins, fiber, because fiber breaks down into short chain fatty acids. That feeds the good bacteria, that builds up that mucosa, and that creates an environment. Because the way that we teach the microbiome is to think of it like a garden. Okay, not a battlefield where we're killing all the bad guys and we bring in all the good guys and we win. Because all I ever see with that, we used to do that. We used to give people antibiotics for their imbalance in their
carpet bomb method. Just kill them all.
Exactly, and all you had left was scorched earth.
Yeah.
And we would then try to give them probiotics after probiotics, billions and trillions, and all we would see colonizing was nothing.
It doesn't work.
So instead, when you start thinking of it more like this garden analogy, what you're actually doing is seeing that you can't just throw a carpet bomb on a garden. Nothing grows except weeds. So instead, you have to make sure that you are actually fertilizing. You have the right soil. You're making sure it's watered, making sure it gets sun. You're making sure you have some love to it. And you also have to make sure that it has a lot of variety, a lot of diversity, a lot of abundance. Because even when there's abundance, you're always going to have a little bit of weeds. In other words, there's always going to be dysbiotic and even pathogenic bacteria in your gut. But if you have this huge abundance and diversity, it never gets to thrive because it's too crowded with everything that's good. So it's not going to break down that mucosa because certain bacteria will actually eat away at that mucosa. Things like Clostridium, Pseudomonas, different yeasts, they will break down a lot of that mucosa, which then exposes that epithelial layer to it being more porous, which then is increased intestinal permeability, i.e. leaky gut. So by addressing it from more a terrain standpoint, now it's basically beneficial for all the probiotics you put in, not just from a supplement standpoint, but also macrobiotic foods, cultured foods. living food.
Mhm.
It's just all of that gets improved when you start off by adding in the things that'll help to bring that kind of beneficial soil back to life.
And it's such a cool thing that you're creating the parallel with a garden being an environmental medicine specialist. The irony of that is not lost on me, but if you look at, and this is a theory I postulated a while ago, if you look at the earth as a living being, right? And you look at the health of the average person walking the planet, I believe that one is a proxy for the other. You know, they're not separate whatsoever. And if you look at what's going on with the earth in terms of the quality of our topsoil, what are we supposed to have? Less than 50 harvests left in our topsoil? You know, there's a lot of scorched land that will grow nothing. It's entirely barren. We can probably assume that that pattern is fractalized in the average person because of what has been exposed to that garden. And, you know, I don't know about you, but if the green thumb gene didn't bite me, I have no knowledge of how to tend to a garden myself. So the average person does not know what they do when they're putting food in their face. I would even go as far as when I go to conferences, I watch what the other health professionals eat secretly because I go, how on it are you to understand that, you know, you're preaching something, you're doing something, but where's your awareness yourself? Because I believe you have to also walk the talk if you're going to be educating people on these things, because if you do it, it creates a power and momentum and energy to help people catch fire, so to speak, and they shift faster.
There's a huge component to walking the walk. There's a huge component that if you're going to be in environmental medicine, you better know soil. You better know the earth. You better know what's causing the earth to suffer. And the chemicals, the land, the topsoil, the erosion, the pollution, you know, and it's not just what's in the air, because whatever's in the air is falling to the ground, it's falling in the water. You know, why can't we eat fish anymore? Because we have so many pollutants that have gone up into the air that we've literally poisoned our oceans. I mean, that is just mind-blowing. You know, and that's a man-made problem that we have the innovation to correct just as much as we had the innovation to corrupt. It's just the will. And it's not a federal thing to me. It's a local thing to me. It is, if everybody started realizing that food comes from the ground and not from somebody's store, and we all went back to post-depression where we all had gardens, then we wouldn't be having a debate that's political. We would be having a debate about how can we do this together. And we wouldn't have to worry about what somebody else is going to do to save us. We'd be saying, well, we're doing this and our neighbor's doing this and our community's doing this. So why aren't you all doing it?
We may be
That's
heading
where
that way.
change
Yeah.
in my mind happens, because if we keep just yelling at each other about we need to do this and or you need to do that, but I'm going to sit here in my, you know, high-rise apartment in downtown Manhattan that is just spewing out stuff into the environment, and I'm just going to sit here on my computer and yell at you, you're not doing anything. But if you actually start or join a community co-op, join a community garden, start learning where your food comes from, then maybe you start actually coming up with some solutions. And there are people that are doing amazing work when it comes to revitalizing all of that poisoned ground. And there's ways to do it. It's just the will. You know, we have poisoned our topsoil in some of the most fertile land we've ever had by conventional farming for decades. And if we were to listen to some of these innovators like Joel Salatin, who's totally understood regenerative farming, you know, and all of the different types of ways to do that, I 100% agree with you that the landscape that we're seeing in our environment is the landscape we're seeing in our bodies, because they're one and of the same. We breathe it, we drink it, we eat it.
We go back to it when we pass on too, right? You know, we're borrowing things, and be responsible with what you borrow. You know, maybe this is a way to kind of postulate a development of that theory. if we get people in tune with themselves and becoming more aware of putting goodness into this, reverse engineering some of the problems, we will then see that I think there will be an elevation of thought and vibration, so to speak, where they're going to start voting with their dollars rather than going to a supermarket. It's a farmer's market. Rather than, going to the grocery store to get some meat on sale, you're going to find a butcher. You're going to get to know a farmer, and you're going to support that process so you can start bringing some of these things back. I wanted to ask one more quick thing that kind of fits in with this because you mentioned it, talking about how to clean up the waste, so to speak. We're talking about waste of the planet, but you mentioned systemic enzymes. So this is an area that I believe countries like Germany and various other parts of Europe have had these things as part of regular practice in all aspects of the medical system for multiple decades. I think systemic enzymes are underutilized, very much misunderstood and underappreciated in the Western world. How do you use them in your clinical practice to help people deal with, the messiness of their garden per se, things leaking into the body from the gut, inflammatory reactions, and the immune system being overly vigilant? What's your approach there?
Well, I can't take credit for my knowledge on systemic enzymes. I 100% give credit to Jeff Thurston, because I very much, for probably the last 8 or 9 years, were very much utilizing enzymes for digestion only. And I understood the digestion of different foods, utilizing enzymes and utilizing acid, and optimizing the breakdown of our food so that it could be absorbed better. Once I talked to Jeff and understood the benefits of systemic enzymes like serapeptase and nattokinase, and all the different possibilities of, and the way that they're working isn't by acid. It's not just dissolving things, but what it does, it helps to break down some of the connective tissue damage that's happening through some of these chronically inflammatory processes, and breaking down some of the clotting pieces like fibrin that it's actually, creating some of the problems when it comes to heart disease and joint problems. So by utilizing some of these systemic enzymes, we are gobbling up some of the remnants of collateral damage that then trigger some of the chronic inflammatory processes that are exacerbating what we've been exposed to. So that's my understanding from a systemic enzyme standpoint, but I'm just scratching the surface of what the potential, because when we start talking about things like spike protein and long haul COVID, one of the things that is really coming out as being very beneficial is nattokinase to break down the spike protein so that it can get actually eliminated while our body stops overreacting to it. And that can be a hugely transformative process for somebody who's suffering with these long haul symptoms. And that's something even Dr. Peter McCullough is actually advocating for in his program, in addition to utilizing a mast cell stabilization of bromelain and quercetin. So that's where that overreactivity triggers a histamine reaction, which leads to even more inflammatory processes. So there's a lot to that, and I'm very much oversimplifying at this point, but to get the gist of the possibility of what these can do, that to me is a huge component, and also a safe component, because as Jeff talked about, enzymes aren't acid. They don't just eat through arteries. They don't eat through veins. They're not going to just rip through your stomach lining. They have a very specific target. And if they don't see that target, they're not going to do anything. But once they get to that target, they're going to speed up the reaction of it breaking down. So that's what we're looking for. And that, I think, is very much underutilized in medicine in general. And it's starting to pick up some momentum with this possibility of it helping with long haul symptoms.
I mean, in some ways, it's an unfortunate way to present something and its usefulness to the world, but it finds a way to do it however it needs to be seen or understood, right? It's the one thing that's so wonderful about using systemic enzymes is there almost is no downside. There is almost zero potential danger. And then some people will cite, yes, warfarin, blood thinner interactions, to which, yeah, may be true, but that also may just be, kind of like an old wives' tale kind of precaution, not saying that it is. But theoretically, it's probably not going to cause you to bleed out if you cut yourself shaving, so to speak, if you're adding some nattokinase to your morning routine. But the reality of the situation is, if we go back to that example of the earth and the human body, the parallel patterns that we're seeing, if we don't figure out how to clean up our systems and deal with the fact that we're being bombarded more than ever with environmental compounds and, from what you said, non-physical compounds, what would be some general takeaway strategies that you would share with people in terms of how to optimize their environment starting tomorrow? It can be from simple execution stuff to more high level stuff. I leave it to you to kind of close this out.
Oh man. Wow. Talk about teeing it up. So, Roland, I'll go simple to complex. Okay. First thing we ever talk about when we talk to our patients from a follow-up standpoint is the three have tos. Are you sleeping? Are you eating? Are you pooping? You can take care of those three things and you're optimizing those and you are happy with it. A lot of the rest of the things go well. If any one of those three are not working very well, you can't go any farther. You've got to address those first. Because if you aren't getting enough in or you're not getting the right things in, you're not going to build up that energy potential. If you're not eliminating, you're building up that burden, whether it's just from a bacterial standpoint, from a burden of chemicals, but also metabolites from those living organisms are building up. If you have yeast in your gut and you are constipated, that's releasing ammonia. That's from that fermentation process. That's releasing aldehydes, which turn into alcohol. So that alone, just having it not get eliminated, is a problem. So that alone works on that economics of energy. The making sure you sleep is recovery. If you don't sleep, your body can't repair, which means the next day is starting from a deficit position. So you have to make sure that you allow yourself enough time to recover. And restless sleep and all of that is all part of it. And that has to do with the bigger complex puzzle of making sure that you are well, rested, but also that you have energy to sleep. I have many of my patients where I talk to them that they're so tired that they're wired and tired, that they can't fall asleep because they don't have enough energy to repair anything. So the body wakes them up saying, hey, we need energy, let's go. And so those three are kind of the crucial beginnings. From that next step, it is try to understand that there is more to burden than things that are toxic to you. Don't smoke, don't drink, don't you illicit drugs. But I'll tell you, the biggest addiction in our society are these dumb boxes. It is these phones that we spend hours a day on, staring at, creating distractions, but also spiking our dopamine on a regular basis. And that in turn is turning up those neurotransmitters to become overreactive. But I think what's even worse is that now that's 2 to 3 hours that we're not living, we're not doing. We're watching other people live. And I find that to be an increasing problem. And that's where a lot of people are now becoming Insta famous or TikTok stars. And people are literally spending hours staring at them. All you have to do is look at one of these videos and see how many views it's had. 1 million views is not even abnormal anymore. Like, that's common. And to me, that means there's 1 million people that just got dumber that day. that
When you put it that way,
literally
it's
could have
true.
been doing something. And even rest. I mean, yeah, people say, oh, I'm doing it just to chill out. Yeah, but you can chill out and read a book. You can chill out and listen to music.
That's the
That
thing with the
actually
pages that you flip.
enhances.
That's what a book is, right? The thing with the pages
Yeah,
that no
right.
one
Yeah,
picks
one
up
of those
anymore.
things. Exactly. And that encourages you to do instead of not do.
Mhm.
And living, which also then incorporates get outside, get into nature, you know, go get your hands dirty, dig a hole, plant something. I can't tell you how connected you feel when you shut everything out and just listen to nature. I mean, I've literally prescribed nature therapy to my patients and have prescribed beach therapy because we're not that far from an ocean. Like, go. You will clear your mind like there's no tomorrow if you just go and just try to tune out everything else. Those are kind of those basics. When it gets to then kind of the next level of people that are fighting chronic inflammatory conditions, then it gets to be where you got to start thinking about it from a action standpoint of making sure that you're getting enough vitamins and minerals, making sure that you are optimizing what you're eating. So like digestive enzymes, probiotics, making sure that you're getting adequate rest, because that's a part of your job when it comes to healing chronic inflammation. You know, next level to that is get to somebody who understands that getting that energy optimization is the key to you actually getting over some of the chronic inflammatory things is critical. And not, if somebody starts and ends with your symptoms, they are looking to basically get you through that symptom, and then that's it. If you can start to get to someone that asks more why questions, oh, I have this pain in my back. Why? Well, why? Is it an injury, or is there something that's going on? Is there something about your posture? Is that, if you have somebody who's asking these why questions, or you're asking your practitioner and they're receptive to it, that's your teammate. That's your partner in crime.
Mhm.
But if you have somebody who keeps saying, no, just take this and you'll be fine, that to me is a question that you would want to start to investigate new and other types of people to be on your team. And take advantage of the fact that we live in a society now where we have options. Having the internet open up all of these possibilities to where we can talk to practitioners that aren't in our little area allows you to then partner with people that get this in a much more comprehensive way. And that's if it gets to that level where you really feel like I need testing to really sort this out. Hopefully that's a good kind of way of getting things rolling for patients that not only want to just feel better, but have specific things that they want sorted out in a way that from an environmental medicine perspective really addresses everything, affects everything.
And it comes back to the first statement we made on the call. And that's always the best way to round out these conversations. I mean, Barry, this is one of the most enjoyable conversations I've had in the last little while. Thank you so much for sharing all the wisdom. You're clearly on the route to becoming a true master at what it is you do. And I know you probably was like, oh, I'm just learning, but it's amazing what it is that you have figured out, and the pieces you're putting together are things that are really going to help people if they're ready for that level of complexity in their thinking, and also ready for that level of commitment in undergoing a process. So is there anywhere that people can find you, anywhere that you want to share with them that they can connect perchance?
Yeah, we are Healing Provisions, and we're we're online. I do see patients in person. I do see patients online, but they have to be in Texas, simply because the COVID kind of freedom of seeing patients out of state has ended. So if it's something where you really feel like I'm the person for you and you want to, you can give our office a call. You can look us up online. It's just healingprovisions.net. And talk to us. We do free 15-minute phone calls for anybody who's interested, because I really want people to feel comfortable. I really want them to feel like we're a good fit. And that way then And if it's something where I can't, it's not going to work out, I will do my best to find you somebody. And if that's something where you're trying to find someone in your state that kind of has the same philosophy as me, then I absolutely encourage you to look up the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, aaemonline.org. And on our homepage, we've got Find a Practitioner. And we've got practitioners all over the country.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that, Barry. And I'm hoping our paths cross again soon. Appreciate your time, your wisdom, your knowledge. Thanks for being on Masterclass.
You're welcome. And I appreciate everything you're doing, Roland, and love the fact that you're on the same path with us. And thank you to Master Supplements and US Enzymes for the opportunity.